some of what you're going to hear is going to be a little bit familiar to her because I'm going to talk about two books really, but I'll do it very briefly. I just want to sort of make sure everybody sort of knows how I came to write these books about rescue dogs, because it was not.
You started?
Yeah, that's okay. I'm just getting started.
Okay, so
we're gonna have Who Wants a Brownie? I'll save mine for later.
yeah, best brownies in the world. Martha
Okay.
brings the best brownies. So if you're
No, that's just chocolate chips.
ready to.
All right. So 5 years ago, rescue dogs weren't even on my radar screen, and I was not a likely candidate to write any books about dogs. So I want to tell you how I came to write these two books. I'm going to focus on the new one, but I also want to tell you a little bit about the other one. So it was 2012, and for more than 20 years, my wife had been trying to get me to adopt a dog, and I always refused. And then our kids wanted dogs. I had two sons, and as they grew up, of course, they wanted dogs. And I kept them busy with hamsters, and we had a cockatiel, and we had goldfish, everything I could think of to sort of fend them off. And I didn't want a dog for a couple of reasons. First of all, when I was growing up, I was allergic, even though we had a dog. Second, I'm kind of picky about the house, and I didn't want the mess, the muddy paws, the fur. And most of all, I didn't believe anyone's promises that they would wake up at 6 o'clock in February to walk a dog on the ice so it could do its business. So I tried to fend everyone off for a long time. When my younger son was about to be a senior in high school, and I looked over the horizon and saw this sort of empty house with just the two of us, that wall of opposition just collapsed. And I said to Judy one day, I said, let's look for a dog. Not a puppy, but let's look for a dog. And I had no idea how to go about getting a dog. I didn't know anything about the dog world. And she and my son went up as far as Maine to visit breeders, legitimate breeders, not puppy mills, to see if they could find a 2-year-old dog that sort of would fit our life, 2 or 3 years old. And nothing clicked. And then one day, Judy came home from a yoga class and said, there's a guy in my yoga class named Jay, and he just adopted what he said is the best dog he's ever had from a group called Labs for Rescue in Connecticut. She said, what do you think about a rescue dog? And I had a completely blank look because I thought rescue dog meant this. And that was literally my picture of a rescue dog and the extent of my knowledge. And as bad as the winters are in Massachusetts, I thought this was overkill. So I quickly got educated and learned, of course, that rescue dogs are dogs like these. And you're probably familiar with this. These are the neglected, the abandoned, the runaways, the strays, the real underdogs who, through no fault of their own, find themselves in shelters like this, primarily in the southern United States. And many of these shelters I've been to them, they're pretty grim places, and because the overpopulation problem is so severe, in shelters like this, often 80 to 90% of the dogs that come in never leave and are put down to make room for the next wave of dogs that come in. So, having always been somewhat predisposed to underdogs in general, not just the canine variety, but underdogs in every manner, I was on board with the idea of getting a rescue dog, but again, no idea how to really go about it. But we went on the website of Labs for Rescue to look at the profiles of the dogs they had up for adoption. And we started looking through the pictures, and you may remember this. We came upon this guy, and I just took one look at the picture and I stopped. And I thought he was the most earnest looking dog I had ever seen. And something about the picture just spoke to me. There was a little description of Albie. He was about 3 years old. And then at the bottom, a short video of about 30 seconds that I showed the last time. And at the end of 30 seconds, I was so in love with this dog and attached and worried all at the same time. And my first question was, oh, this is the one. How quickly can we get down to Connecticut and get him? And that's when I found out he wasn't in Connecticut, even though that's where Labs for Rescue is. He was still at the shelter in Louisiana, where he had been picked up as a stray 5 months earlier. He'd been in the shelter 5 months. Very lucky to survive that long, because most of the dogs that are there, if they're not adopted or claimed, in a few days they're put down. But there was this volunteer there who took a shine to Albie and kept getting him a reprieve week after week until she got him into the Labs for Rescue program, and we came along and said, he's the one. So I found out he was in Louisiana, and of course I just thought, oh my God, how long are we gonna have to wait? And I was worried about him being in the shelter, and I was already forming attachments to him. So a few weeks later, our adoption coordinator, let me get this water, our adoption coordinator named Carrie Toth, down in Louisiana, called and said that there's room on the transport for one more dog this week, and Albie's gonna be on it. Now, she said transport. I knew that had something to do with how he was gonna get to us, but I had no picture of what transport really looked like when it came to dogs. And I'm gonna come back to that in a moment. So Albie arrived in early July of 2012, having been astray for God knows how long, in a shelter for 5 months, very stressful for dogs. Then on this big truck for 5 days, and then in Massachusetts, another 48 hours in isolation in a shelter in Medfield, because that's the rule in Massachusetts for rescue dogs coming from out of state. So by the time he got out of the car at our house, he was a bit of an unguided missile. And he was very sweet, but he didn't quite seem to know what to do with himself. And for the first month or 5 weeks that he was with us, we couldn't coax him upstairs at night. And he slept underneath the coffee table in the living room because he felt safe there. And we started to conjecture about why that was so. Maybe he never lived in a house with stairs. We honestly had no idea. But in any event, every night we'd say goodnight, and Albie would sleep under the coffee table. And you may remember this, but I had told my wife, Judy, when I agreed to get a dog, that I had one condition, and that was that we were not sleeping in bed with a dog. And after about 5 weeks, one night I was looking for Albie under the coffee table, and I couldn't find him. And I went upstairs, I turned the corner into our bedroom, and there he was in our bed, and what I describe as having taken his literal and figurative leap of faith onto the bed. And in retrospect, I really look back on that as the moment he was telling us, this is my home and you're my family. It was that moment. And when people adopt a rescue dog, and I write about this in the new book, I encourage them to kind of look for a moment like this. It's not always so clear cut, and it may be, some dogs make themselves at home right away. Some take a while to acclimate. But to me, this was Albie's way of telling us. And of course, he stayed in the bed. I told Judy she could sleep in the guest room because I was not going to kick him out of bed. Now, in those early days, I wished I could have asked him any one of a million questions. How did you come to be wandering alone in central Louisiana? Did you have a family? Did you run away? Did anybody ever hurt you? What was it like in the shelter? Obviously, he couldn't answer those questions. At the same time that those questions were running through my head, of course, Albie and I were taking a lot of walks in the woods near where we lived and meeting a lot of other people with dogs. And to my surprise, it seemed like 9 out of 10 of them were telling me their dog came from Tennessee or Alabama or Mississippi, Texas, some southern state. And I say, even though I knew we got Albie from Louisiana, I didn't really know why. So I really wanted to know, why are there so many dogs like Albie up here in the Northeast, in New England in particular? So to answer that question, I emailed the man, his name is Greg Maley, who had driven the truck that transported Albie north. Now, we had never met him because we couldn't pick Albie up at the truck in Connecticut. It's complicated, but he went to Medfield, to the shelter for 48 hours. So we didn't meet Greg. But I emailed Greg and I said, I'm really interested in what you do. I thought he might be my window into this whole world. And I tried to persuade him to let me come see what he does and to meet him on the last night of one of his trips on this route he takes, which I'll describe in a moment, and see if I could write an article about it. I thought he might, help me understand this whole process. This is Greg. dropping off one of about 80 dogs that he carries on each trip in Connecticut. And so the first time I met Greg, I actually flew down to Pennsylvania and met him on the last night of one of these regular trips, and then drove with him to New England the next day to see all this and how it unfolds, and slept in the truck, in the trailer, with Greg in the back. And it's really a remarkable, this is what the first book was about. It really became the story of Greg and all the people who have to put their hands and extend their hearts to these dogs just to get them on Greg's truck. And I'll talk about that in a second. But he's a remarkable guy. He makes this trip of over 4,000 miles twice a month, from Ohio to the Gulf Coast to New England. He's now got a new trailer, and it's a really stressful job. It's an enormous amount of driving, number one, and he's responsible for 80 dogs like Albie that he knows are lucky as all get out to just be on his truck, and we have anxious families waiting for them up here. So it's a real burden to me. He wants them to get there safe and sound and healthy. So it's a really exhausting, laborious job. And then through Greg, and then I ended up the article that I wrote for Parade Magazine got such a response that it turned into the first book, which was this one. And in the process of taking several of the complete trips with Greg, I also met all these folks down south, like Kerry, who would help save Albie, who do this unbelievably heartbreaking work. They walk through shelters, decide what dogs they think they can help, which ones they can't, and they expend enormous amounts of money, time, and heartache, because it's a tough thing. Because for every dog there's a happy ending like Albie, there are countless dogs that they know they're not going to save. So it's really tough. So this was my chance to really learn about this whole process of how these dogs like Albie come to us. And this book ended pretty much with what we call Gotcha Day, which is the day when you get your dog, let's say off the, when you meet Greg's truck, or you go to the shelter and get the dog. And it ended pretty much with moments like this, when this dog is just meeting this child and his family for the first time. And so I started getting pictures like this. I just like to show a couple of these. Either they were posted on Facebook or people started sending them to me, but there were hundreds of them started to come. And I just have a couple of ones I like to show. I like this one in particular, because it's not always the book. I thought it was good, but it wasn't always so interesting, I guess. And of the hundreds, but of the hundreds, this is my favorite actually, because. And I got to tell you, I've looked at this picture. I look at this picture every time I give this talk, and there's not a trace of remorse on that face. So in any event,
what do you know?
Yeah, everyone's a critic. So in any event, so that was the first book. So with that book sort of ending really with the moment that these dogs finish their journey and arrive here and are matched with their families. This book sort of picks up the story in a sense where that leaves off. What's it like to live with these dogs? What kinds of, what does it take to help a dog like this acclimate to your family? And what are the challenges? And what do they give you in return? Because they do. They give you so much more back in return. But the first question, in a sense that the book addresses is, so why a rescue dog? I had a lot of misconceptions about these dogs that I think keep a lot of people from adopting rescue dogs, which is, they're damaged goods, or they're second-class citizens, or they've been through too much and they're going to have all kinds of behavioral problems, all kinds of health problems. The truth is, no matter where you get a dog, from the best breeder, from pet store, wherever, they're all individuals, and there's no guarantees, just like there are no guarantees when you have kids, as I've learned myself. There are challenges that come with any dog. But there are a lot of important reasons, and when I answer this question, rather than sort of list the reasons to adopt a rescue dog, it's better to tell a couple of quick stories. Now, obviously, this aspect of it wasn't in this book because the book was already finished, but of course, this fall, a series of hurricanes, particularly, thinking about Houston, and as I'm going to mention later, there are a lot of stray dogs in Houston. And during these storms, awareness of the overpopulation problem spikes. People often think, because Albie's from Louisiana, he's a Katrina dog. He was born years after Katrina. It's an ongoing chronic problem that spikes during storms like this. But during emergencies like this, some people will do the right thing. Some of these pictures may look familiar from the news. Some will not. And, this is why, people go out and try and save these dogs that have been left behind. And I'll tell you the story of one of them. This little puppy was found during the hurricane in Houston, abandoned in a shoebox near a school in Dickinson, Texas. Dickinson is if you remember back, everybody's seen this picture of these women in a nursing home up to here in water. That was Dickinson, Texas. And someone found him in the shoebox and brought him to a nearby shelter. He had parvo. She had parvo, which is very lethal in puppies particularly. But lucky for her, this guy Tom English, who I actually met while working on Rescue Road, who is an amazing guy and now lives in Southeast Texas, and just rescues tons of dogs, and has volunteered his services to a local shelter where he's helped bring the euthanasia rate down dramatically. And he made his way. His house was okay. He made his way to the shelter, and with the help of a veterinarian there, worked out a treatment plan for this little dog and took her home, because he's got all kinds of, because he does so much rescue work, he's very well set up to take care of dogs with special needs too. So I will come back to Stormy's story in a moment, but this is why you rescue dogs, because there's so many that need help. And as I mentioned, this is an ongoing chronic problem. In Houston, over 1 million strays on the streets. And I walked some of these neighborhoods where they tend to congregate in Rescue Road, and needless to say, they tend to be the poorer neighborhoods where, I'll call the local police about, there's some stray dogs will never get answered. If you live in River Oaks in Houston and there's a stray dog, that's sort of the Beverly Hills of Houston, they'll be out there to take care of it right away. One of the dogs I do write about in the new book is this little dog, Noah, who was found in a part of Houston that's notorious for abandoned dogs, and he was extremely sick. All kinds of ailments, mange, heartworm, infections, and lucky for Noah, he ended up in the arms of a woman named Kathy Wetmore, who I wrote about in Rescue Road, who is a one-woman operation in Houston, a one-woman rescue. She does it all. And she agreed to take Noah and try and get him nursed back to health, and invested $10,000 in his veterinary care to get him well. And I always tell people, if you wonder why a rescue is charging you $400 or $500 as an adoption fee, it almost never covers the costs. But Noah recovered and was adopted by a couple in Brooklyn, Linda and Andrea, and that's Sadie, his canine sibling. And so again, when people say, why a rescue dog? Because of Noah. Because there's so many dogs like Noah out there. He's just the sweetest thing, and they love him, and he's a wonderful dog. And if somebody doesn't step up for a dog like Noah, he would perish. Another dog like Noah, Lola, was found in a shelter in Baltimore by this fellow. He walked in. She had been been overbred. She was in a pit bull, a dog fighting ring, and she'd been overlooked in the shelter. She was about 9 years old, and she'd been there for a while. And this fellow walked in, and he told the staff, I want the dog that's been here the longest. I don't care what breed, I don't care what it looks like, I don't care the sex, but I want the dog that you can't adopt out. And the reason that would have been the end of the story, but one of the shelter volunteers actually recognized him, and he's 6'6" and weighs 300 pounds, so he's kind of a person you notice. But he was about to start his rookie season with the Baltimore Ravens in the NFL, and he plays for the Ravens still. And I interviewed him for this book, and it was just a great story. I mean, to walk in and just say, give me the dog that nobody else will take. He loves her to death. And again, why adopt a rescue dog? Dogs like Lola. The reason though, I'm going to just tell you briefly about these dogs in the Bahamas and the Turks and Caicos called pot cakes, is because I really want to introduce you to a little girl that I met on my last book tour. you can go down there to the main island in Turks and Caicos, and there's a rescue on the island, a rescue organization, and they're always looking for visitors to help socialize the dogs. And so you can go in the morning and get a puppy, and they'll give you a little bag with water and a ball and treats, and you can go to the beach across the street and hang out with these puppies for a few hours. We did it every day because we were missing our own dogs so much. And they're called pot cakes because the islanders traditionally would feed these stray dogs the caked remains of a traditional rice dish that they would get caked in the bottom of the pots. They'd scrape it out and they'd feed it to the dogs. So those are pot cakes. But the reason I wanted you to know about pot cakes is I met this little girl 2 years ago when I was at the Melrose Library talking about Rescue Road. And whenever I saw young kids come to the book talks, I always would go and talk to their parents and to them to tell them, there's kind of some sad stuff here, some tough stories. I just want you to be prepared. And she just looked at me and she said, I've already read your book. And she was 8 years old. And she told me that from the time she was 6 on a trip, they went on a trip to the Bahamas, her family, and she learned about pot cakes. And she started her own little rescue called Tegan's Treasures to raise money to help this rescue organization down in the Bahamas. Now, she and her dad have 7 rescue dogs now, including 5 pot cakes. But when I met Tegan, she had raised almost $6,000, just with little jars and selling T-shirts and stuff to donate to this organization. It's now over $10,000 that she's raised for them. And a year, not last year, but the year before, in recognition of what she'd done, the Red Sox let her throw out the first pitch at Fenway Park, which was very sweet. But when I asked Tegan the question that we started with, why adopt a rescue dog, this is what she said to me. If you get a dog from a breeder, it's just a random dog and it's not in danger. The dogs in the Bahamas are dying. Pretty straightforward answer from a kid. And so this is why I encourage people to think about rescue dogs. Because you've got Noah and Stormy, who we'll come back to, and Lola and Albie, who you can see is still in bed. And these are the reasons, because these dogs are lovely, wonderful, incredible companions. And if someone doesn't step up for them, they will die. And with 1 million strays in Houston and with shelters euthanizing somewhere between 3/4 and 1 million dogs in shelters in the United States every year, why are we buying dogs from puppy mills that are turning out dogs when there are all these dogs that need homes? So one thing I think is important whenever you make the first leap into getting a dog is to realize it's not always going to be that perfect moment you imagine, the fluffy puppy running through, amber waves of grain. And I think the most common reason that an adoption doesn't succeed is because people have unrealistic expectations of dogs. I don't want a dog that barks or chews my sneakers or does this or that. But this is what dogs do, and you have to be prepared. So sometimes it is a hallmark moment. These are our first 2 together in the back of the car. But this is the only time they're like this, is in the back of the car. Usually they're fighting over toys. He's flipping her over on her back and they're nipping it. They get along, but it's not always peaceful and it's not always under our control like it appears there. And dogs will do things that you have to be prepared for. Now the point isn't that you have to allow your dog to do this repeatedly, but you've got to try and understand why a dog might do this and not lash out at the dog, but understand that the dog has no other way to communicate. So these dogs require us to be as compassionate as we can and to try and understand, what anxiety, for example, might lead a dog to do this. On the subject of hallmark moments, we've started to go down to the Charleston area for a few weeks in the winter just because we can't stand the winter. And this is after 2 days in the car and Albie and Selena on the beach, and it's a beautiful moment. And I look over at one point and I realize that Selena is eating something. And I go over to see what it is. And it turns out that because of the tides and the wind, sometimes when they hit a certain way, thousands of starfish wash up on the beach. And I go over and I realize it's like the seafood buffet at Golden Corral. She is just eating these things so fast, and they're like wallets. They're tough as leather. And my first thought is, I seem to remember reading that starfish are toxic. So we have this beautiful moment, sunbathe moment. We just get there, and all of a sudden, I'm like, oh my God, what are we going to do? We get back to the place where we're staying down the beach, and I start calling veterinarians' offices. And nobody's ever heard of this is in coastal South Carolina, nobody's ever heard of a dog eating a starfish. And they say, they might be toxic, we don't know. Just keep an eye on her and see if there's any signs of any neurological symptoms. Well, as it turns out, she didn't have any neurological symptom. And I won't be too graphic about this, but whatever goes in has to come out eventually, and not in the most pleasant way. And all week, we could not keep her away from these things. Even when we tried with a leash, she would somehow find one somewhere, and next thing we knew, it was down. We just needed to make sure that 2 hours after she ate a starfish, we needed to be outside somewhere. So I'll leave it at that. Now, same trip, next day. We're on the beach again, and Selena goes running by, and Albie takes off after her. And she's pretty agile, and she makes this sharp turn to the left, and Albie tries to make his sharp turn to the left, and he crumbles in a heap, and he howls, and he lifts up his leg, and I'm like, oh my God, I think he's broken his leg or something. I go running down to him, and the poor thing, and I can see it just from the look on his face, he's petrified. And, I wasn't prepared for how much I was going to love this dog, and how much it would hurt me when he was hurting, and how frustrating it would be not to be able to tell him, it's going to be okay, we're going to get you somewhere where they can help you, and you'll feel better. And you can only hope that the tone of your words and your physical presence will convey that. So here we are the next day. I had to carry him 80 pounds back to where we were staying down the beach. And the next morning, he couldn't even come down the stairs. And he was quivering. I felt he wasn't recoiling at any point when I touched him. So I'm back on the phone to the vets who I just called about the starfish. They must think, these people from Boston, what is with them? So I bring Albie in. They couldn't find anything particularly wrong. It wasn't broken. It wasn't until we got back here and went to Tufts down in Walpole. Albie was diagnosed with pretty advanced arthritis. And he had to have this, they use a laser to kind of warm the area, and it led to sort of a hallmark or not so hallmark moment, which I love this picture because everyone in the room has to wear goggles, including the dogs. And he's just so patient, which I love. But one of the point of this really is that when we bring these dogs into our homes, we have to teach them to live with us, but it's our job really to learn how to live with them and let them live their lives as dogs and not with all kinds of unrealistic expectations that they're going to be perfectly behaved all the time. In the interviews that I did for this book, it's not just our story of living with our dogs, but I interviewed a lot of other people. And I heard so many really great stories of how these dogs who come into our lives, we think we're doing them a favor, but how much they repay it. So one of them is this dog, Tabiso, which means bringer of joy in the Sesotho language. Allison Smith, who is the mom in that family, was a Peace Corps volunteer in Africa, and she gave all the dogs these Sesotho names. And Tabiso was a rescue dog, and then was trained as a therapy dog. So, people, again, they have these misconceptions these dogs are untrainable or damaged goods, and it's absolutely not true. And he's now done 1,000 visits, over 1,000 visits to nursing homes, schools, you name it. And Allison told me every day that he goes to this second grade class, he seems to know intuitively which child needs his attention that day. Another person I met when I was giving a book talk about the last book was Ellen Lee of Arlington, Mass. She came to a book talk in Porter Square with her service dog, Ricky, and I was amazed to watch this dog take off her coat, put on her coat, help her get it on and off. And I was really interested because I'd never really talked to someone with a service dog, and we met a few weeks later for coffee, and she, she has mitochondrial disease, and so for the past few years she has not been able to walk or work, and someone convinced her to look into NEADS, National Education Assistance Dog Services out in Princeton, Mass. And she said, maybe I can do this. And so she got a NEADS dog. These dogs are trained for people with all kinds of disabilities or PTSD. A lot of work dogs they're training to help veterans. And Ricky technically isn't a rescue dog, although many NEADS dogs are rescues. Ricky was actually raised by Guiding Eyes for the Blind, but couldn't be a Guiding Eyes dog. But what was interesting about her story was that it's not just that Ricky helps her with her activities of daily living, but it's given her a great sense of purpose to have Ricky to take care of, because she's confined a lot of the time. And so he has literally opened doors, and she can do things she could never do before, out sailing in Boston Harbor. She says even when she just goes out to the market or even to doctor's appointments, Ricky opens up all kinds of conversations. So it's really been a great thing for her. One of the more interesting interviews I did for the book was with this fellow, Jason Bertrand. When I interviewed Jason a little over a year ago, he was just finishing a 15-year sentence for armed robbery in a Florida prison. And he was participating in one of these Paws and Prisoners programs. You may be familiar. These are rescue dogs. And the rescue organization, this one happens to be the Pitt Sisters in Jacksonville. To help socialize the dogs and get them ready for adoption, they are matched with a prisoner and a professional trainer. And, it's great for the dogs. It's great for the prisoners who have a sense of purpose in training these dogs. But they noticed that he had a particular bond with this dog he was training and decided the dog should remain with him. He was scheduled to be released just before Christmas of last year. And so the dog lived with him in the prison for the last couple of months and then stayed with him when he was released. And he's now working and has an apartment, and he told me that the dog has really helped with this transition. But he said, more to the point, when he was in prison, he said, I rarely smile here. It's a tough place to be, but whenever I see her, I smile. And I think he told me this, or at least I heard it from maybe one of the people in the organization that provided this dog. This is the first non-judgmental companionship he's known in 15 years, right? The dog doesn't know it's being raised in a prison or that he's, serving time for armed robbery. So to have that kind of non-judgmental companionship is very therapeutic. But those are kind of extraordinary stories about how dogs provide, have therapeutic value. But I sort of came to the conclusion, after all the people I talked to for this book, that all dogs are therapy dogs in one way or another. And why is that? I think it's because, it says here, dogs are so much in the moment. This is Noah, the dog from Houston. This is his canine sister. These dogs, some of them may have emotional trauma that, you have to work hard with them to overcome, but they don't live in the past the way we tend to. They don't mull over mistakes they made yesterday or what happened yesterday. This dog, Zosha, also a Florida dog who had lost her hind legs in a terrible accident. And the woman who was his caretaker at the time was not the woman in the picture, but another woman who happens to be deaf, as a matter of fact, told me by email that she said she doesn't know she's missing her back leg. She just does whatever. If she's not in her little trailer here, and I call her, she runs over anyway, and she's not thinking about this accident or, what she's missing. And so I think dogs help us keep that sense of perspective that, we all want to be, I think we all strive to be more mindful of our time and to appreciate the moment. And these dogs, this is a group of now I think 10 rescued labs that live with a woman named Adrienne Finney in Vermont. And I went to visit Adrienne and to see her group of dogs. And when I look at, we have one of our three as a ball hound like this one. But I look at the dogs and they're chewing on sticks or they're chasing balls and they're totally content with that. And I often look at them with envy. And I think if I could be this content with so little, my life would be a lot better. And you may have seen this little thing go around the internet, but I think this sort of sums it up. That he's thinking about all the different things in his life he's got to worry about. All the dog is thinking about is, I'm with him. You know, so it's about living in the moment and being more appreciative of, you know, whatever's happening in my day, if it's time for the walk, I got to take the dog for a walk. I've got to interrupt that train of thought and get out there into the woods, and it's very therapeutic. So this is a subject I didn't intend to write about in this new book, but which I ended up writing about because I was hearing so many stories about the sense of loss that comes when these dogs pass away. In fact, the very first interview, I think, by the way, I should say, I think the reason I was avoiding the subject was because after Albie had been with us only a few weeks, it kind of dawned on me, he's not going to be here forever. And it kind of hit me, and I just felt, even now, I can't imagine what it's going to be like. But the very first interview I did for the new book was with a woman named Stacy Schultz out in Ohio. And she and her husband adopted this dog, Jake. At the time they found Jake, he was in a sanctuary for senior dogs, not expecting that he'd ever have his own home. And he was about 11. And he had been, for the first 10 years of his life, chained to a stake at a home in Ohio, left outdoors all year, no matter what the weather, never ran through a stream, never, jumped in a field, or never had any of those pleasures. And Stacy told me that when they met him, he was pretty unsocialized, but he was very sweet. But he was very, she said he was a freight train with fur, was the way she put it. But there was something about Jake. They wanted to give him a chance. And they knew their time would be short because he was 11, but it was even shorter than they expected because just a few months later he was diagnosed with osteosarcoma, and they knew it was going to be, going to eventually kill him. But they didn't want him to suffer at all. So they really were looking for that day, she told me, with the help of their vet, when they would say goodbye to him so that he didn't have to go through any more suffering. And that day finally did come, and they were beside themselves. But a friend of theirs said, you taught Jake what heaven would be like. And at least he went on, and at some point in his life had a family, even if it was short, people who loved him and took care of him, and finally had some peace. The other story was that kind of really struck me was this dog, Bo. Bo was actually in the same family as Tabiso, that therapy dog. And Bo was a rescue, adopted when he was about 9. And he had a lot of health ailments. He had a laryngeal paralysis, which made it hard for him to breathe. He had spinal cord degeneration. And near the end, and this was sort of close to the end a year ago, and he couldn't walk anymore, the Smiths rigged up this contraption, this, I guess a bike trailer, so they could take him out to all the places he used to love to go. But the best part of the story was that Allison told me that Bo really loved the snow. And it was September of a year ago. And they had a brainstorm, and they live in upstate New York, and they called the hockey rink at Rensselaer Polytech, and they delivered a load of snow for Bo. And he spent the last couple of weeks of his life, even when he said it was amazing, it didn't melt as fast as they thought. And so he got to spend his last couple of weeks lying on his snow pile. They call it, she spells it that way now, snow. And what this all said to me when I heard these stories, and what these dogs in a sense give back to us, they draw out our most compassionate, best selves. And this is Albie and me in the Noannet Woodlands, which you know. For me, the relationship with Albie, I think because I know what could have been for him, that on any one of 150 days in that shelter could have been his last, that if we hadn't stepped up for Albie, he probably wouldn't be here. So when I see him, running through the woods or, sleeping soundly and know that he's been well fed and he's safe, it makes it all the more poignant and all the more meaningful to know that you stepped up for this dog. And that's another reason why I think people should rescue dogs rather than shop for dogs. Now, just to kind of close and come back, this little dog, Stormy, the one from Houston who had parvo. So Tom actually nursed her back to health. She recovered. And in September, I wrote a story for the Globe about, I think it was called Who Will Step Up for the Dogs of Houston. This was in the wake of the hurricane. And I had gotten in touch with Tom to find out what was going on, with him and with his rescue work in the wake of this storm. And that's how he introduced me to this little dog. And a doctor in North Carolina saw the article online and tracked Tom down. And this doctor also is a private pilot. He's got a plane, and he flew down and he met her and brought her back to North Carolina, where she has 4. I don't know if they're all equally as dubious about her, but she's now living on this big piece of property with 4 other rescue dogs with this dog. So again, why adopt a rescue dog? Because there are a million dogs just like this one that need someone to step up. So that is the end of the presentation. And so that's Albie in the back. He's our first one. The one that you saw was in that shelter in Alexandria. Selena, the other yellow one, was actually a passenger on Greg Maley's truck when I made one of my trips with him. She was a little puppy. She was one of a litter of puppies that were born in rural central Louisiana, and they were headed up to an adoption event in Rhode Island. We were not thinking of a second dog, let alone a puppy, but she ended up, because she was scared, Greg let me hold her for a lot of the trip instead of her riding in the back. And by the time we got here, I couldn't bear to say goodbye. So she went off with a foster that night. She arrived in New England. And the next morning, we drove down to the adoption event in Rhode Island. We were planning to go anyway just to see what it was all about. And we had tossed and turned all night and still hadn't decided what to do. But once I held her again, after being apart for one night, I was never going to let go. And then John Balaiah, who's the third one, also from Louisiana, we've had her for a little over a year. And she's the most, they're all different personalities. Albie's kind of the goofy big guy. Selena's kind of the demure princess. And John Balaiah is like the happy camper. In the fall, when the leaves are coming, she just sit there, wait for a leaf to fall, and then takes off after it, snags it, realizes it's not edible, puts it down, waits for the next one. But as the fall progresses, and on a windy day when there's 100 leaves, she doesn't know which way to go, and she's just out there enjoying herself for hours. So that's the story of the 2 books. So thank you, guys. So I know you must have a question, because you're a reporter, so you must have.
You answered, what led you to write these books. That was one of my first questions. And you've talked about some of your favorite stories from the book and the interviews that you've done. Do you have specific information about different rescue programs?
Well, there's so many, and there are many good ones right in this area. There are 2 really good ones in Sudbury, Buddy Dog and Save a Dog. They're both good. There's Northeast Animal Shelter in Salem. There's Forever Home in Medfield. There's so many good organizations. And if people are doing this, I get a lot of people ask me for advice about it. You should always ask, if you don't know a rescue organization, if you haven't heard of it, always ask around and get referrals. Same way you would if you were hiring a contractor or trying to get the name of a good doctor or lawyer. They're not all created equal, and some do a better job than others. Oh, the other one I should mention, which is really outstanding, is Schultz's Guest House. I think there's a typo in the next slide, but I'll show you, but it's spelled that way. I left off the M and Dedham. Schultz's is amazing. They get all their dogs from Tennessee. They've got a regular rescue partner down there, and a beautiful piece of property in Dedham. This is what probably every person involved in rescue dreams about having. They've got incredible facilities. So we have a lot of really good rescue organizations, right around here. Those are all good. They're not the only ones. So, finding out other people's experience is always important. You mentioned how hard it can be to get a dog from Yankee Golden Retriever. But part of that's because Goldens are in such high demand.
In New England, Sheltie Rescue is also one of the ones. A good friend of mine is involved with that, and she takes them, she fosters them. If there are issues, she helps train
Right.
them, and then helps them with the loss. So depending on the breed you're interested in, you'll often find a.
Yeah, some rescues are breed specific. I often think it's a way, not just that they're passionate about that breed, but when you go down to a place like Houston, like this woman I mentioned, Kathy Wetmore, Shaggy Dog Rescue. So that's her criteria. Generally, it's Shaggy Dog. But part of the reason, I think, is just to somehow whittle down this enormous universe of need and kind of concentrate, pick a focus somehow. We were talking about this earlier, that it's not a bad sign that these rescues are checking you out pretty diligently. There's a balance to be struck. On the one hand, you don't want to make it so hard that people give up and don't adopt a rescue dog. On the other hand, you want to be sure that you're making a good match, because they want these matches, they want these truly to be forever homes, not kind of like, oh, check it out, and if it doesn't work in a year, pass the dog along to somebody else. And most good rescues, if for some reason it doesn't work out, and there are sometimes legitimate reasons it won't, the contract you sign with them will require that you return the dog back to the rescue. They don't want you saying, oh, this isn't working out, I'm going to put the dog on Craigslist, and you're not going to vet the next family. But it's a tough balance to strike sometimes, because, if you even go back down the line, I saw shelters in Louisiana that were sometimes sending dogs off to other rescues out of state that they weren't 100% sure what that other rescues' vetting procedures were. But if you know the dog is going to die tomorrow because its time is up, maybe it's better to take that chance. But they really try hard. Dogs that have come from tough situations, you don't want them to end up in another tough situation.
How would you recommend that people evaluate a rescue operation that is offering dogs?
Well, you can talk to people who've adopted from them. You can ask veterinarians in the area. A lot of veterinarians see a lot of rescue dogs, and they tend to, a lot of them do tend to be familiar with some of them, particularly if they're local. Those are the two main ways. And the other thing is, if they won't and this is true, especially when people talk, think they're adopting a dog from a breeder, and it may be a puppy mill, let's say, if they won't let you come to the property, that's a warning sign. If they say, we'll meet you here, or we'll bring the dog to you, that's usually not a good sign. They should have nothing to hide. Another thing, there are a lot of dogs that come up that aren't spoken for. Like, they may come to Schultz's, they don't have families yet. People are going to come to Schultz's and meet and greet and see the dogs. You can go to a lot of these rescues and look at the dogs that are here, that are in their care temporarily, or they may be with fosters. If the dog is being fostered, the foster family is a great source of information. This dog doesn't do so well. If you've got cats, this isn't a good dog, or probably not a great dog with kids, but otherwise great. So that's a really good source of information. And you can, they will screen you for this also, but if you're interested in fostering dogs, sometimes that's a good way to find out if it really is going to work for you before you absolutely commit to a dog. But for all of this, I would say that people I've talked to, a lot of them now, who've adopted a rescue dog, overwhelmingly positive experiences. Not necessarily challenge-free experiences, but overwhelmingly positive experiences.
And these are from people who have reached out to you from
just people I've met along the way, people I've interviewed for this book. Somehow you just get, people I meet walking, and we get to talking, and they've got rescue dogs. 99% say, this is the best dog ever. I mean, everybody thinks their dog is the best dog ever, and it probably is. But I'm saying it's going the rescue route, it's not like a lottery. It's not, you're not getting a pig in a poke. You know, a good rescue organization also is going to carefully screen these dogs, and they're going to feel in their own mind that that dog is ready to go. And they want the dog to be set up for success too. It's not in their interest, unless they're just trying to move dogs. This is, again, not a good sign. If they're too eager to just hand off a dog, that's not a good sign. We had a home visit when we adopted Albie from Labs to Rescue. A volunteer came in, brought his dog, which we weren't expecting. Interesting to see how we might respond to having a dog in the house. Asked us a lot of questions. I sometimes wasn't sure what the right answer was, but that's a good sign. And a lot of rescues, if you've had other pets, they'll say, well, who is your veterinarian? They may call your veterinarian.
As far as where the dogs come from who end up in the shelters, and then so what's the on the ground where the dogs come from when they get into the shelters, and then they're taken from shelters. If they're lucky, they might be brought into a rescue program.
Right.
Can
So
you explain that kind of?
So a couple of different scenarios. One is like Carrie, who I mentioned earlier, who's our adoption coordinator. She has a whole network of fosters. So she may go to a shelter. The dog isn't going to come directly from the shelter onto Greg's truck, for example. It's going to be fostered somewhere, for a while anyway. Or some like Acadiana Animal Aid in Lafayette, Louisiana, they have their own big shelter facility, a nice one with a lot of property and room for the dogs to run. So they may take dogs out of shelters and bring them to their facility. Now, if you live down there, I mean, all these shelters, even down south with high euthanasia rates, have their own adoption programs. If you were down there, you could go and adopt directly from these shelters. That can be problematic in certain ways, not for you necessarily, but they're usually not very discriminating about, they want to try and lower it looks good for them the more dogs they can not euthanize. So they may not be, some of these shelters, anybody can walk in and pay the fee and walk out with a dog. And again, is it better than a dog being put down? Well, possibly yes and possibly no. If that dog is going to be put into a situation where it's going to suffer.
Are they mostly, a lot of them are strays, or some of them dogs that have been given up by their owners?
A lot of owner surrenders. You go to these shelters, very often people show up at night and just tie the dog to the fence because they don't want to be seen bringing it back. This happens in veterinarians' offices too. They come in the morning. One story, it's in the first book. The guy who comes in at 6:30 in the morning to open up this Tupperware box, Tupperware container, opens it up, there's a litter of puppies in it. Somebody just leaves there. Better, giving them at least a chance, better than, and this happens, I hate to say it, but litters of puppies are often found alive in dumpsters in rural Louisiana. It's pretty grim.
Sometimes you'll even find a Christmas puppy. The family buys the puppy. Oh, this is wonderful.
Yeah.
And then it pees all over the place.
Yeah, and they think,
they
oh,
don't even know what this is all about. Then they end up bringing it back. And
the worst is that you should never, it's so hard not to be impulsive when you see an adorable dog, but you really have to think about, do I have the time? Do I have the energy for this particular dog? This is not buy a mattress, sleep on it for 30 days and return it.
the cost of vet bills,
Yeah.
food.
Yeah, people just don't, you have to go into it with realistic expectations of all of those things.
How do they get the dogs ready for adoption, a real rescue operation?
They should be vaccinated, spayed, neutered, temperament tested. There's a lot that goes into it. Yeah. What do we can chat again, but I know you have to go. But I appreciate you guys coming. I know it's a small group. I never know whether it's going to be 80 or 3 or 4. It can be anything.
Peter, I wanted to ask you, given the number of strays that are ultimately euthanized, are there any organizations that you're aware of that are trying to look at the root cause of the issue?
There are many, and there are many, but most will tell you there's no magic solution. There's no obvious answer. You have 1 million strays in Houston. They don't even have anyone to bring them to get spayed and neutered, right? So most people I talk to in this work just feel like it's one dog at a time. I'm just saving another dog. I'm not solving the big problem. I mean, we've done a good job in New England but it's taken decades. So shelters here, if you went up to Northeast Animal Shelter in Salem 40, 50 years ago, they would have been filled with local dogs. Now they're bringing dogs from the South. But it's a lot of education. We have a strong spay-neuter culture. I mean, when I went to Houston, I think the last time I saw an unaltered male dog was when I was like 5 years old. You just don't see it around here. You go down south, you see it everywhere.
Hopefully, so you might say across the country there was a problem. What was it about New England? And so hopefully if we can begin to educate.
Well, it's a kind of a cultural shift, and it's a complicated subject, but when people say, what is it about the South? The simplest way to answer it without painting everyone with a broad brush, because a lot of the people doing this great work are Southerners, but they'll tell you stories about how they confronted somebody they saw kicking their dog in front of a convenience store, and the person says to them, what do you care? It's just a dog. That's key, it's just a dog. They don't see it as a companion or a sentient being or a family member. Now that's not universal by any means, but in certain parts of the South, that's the prevailing cultural view. So a lot of people will say it's going to take generations, starting with kids, teach them there's another way. But it's a long uphill climb.
And as far as getting this, the stray dog or puppy proliferation reduced in the north, that's happened through a lot of efforts.
I think a lot of education, I mean, I can't pinpoint it. I couldn't really, I'm not a student of it. I couldn't tell you exactly how it began to change, but it didn't change overnight. And it's not to say the problem has disappeared. I mean, there are local dog fighting rings, and there are local strays, and
There are dog training rings here in New England?
I read an article, I think last year there was a dog fighting ring that was broken up in Massachusetts, I think within the last year.
Rescues come also to like the greyhound racing dogs. A number of my friends, actually a woman in this community, they do rescue.
Right.
Greyhound rescue.
Yeah.
So that's another group that.
Complicated
Didn't
problem.
we have a referendum to stop greyhound racing now?
To stop.
Didn't we stop greyhound racing with a referendum a few years ago?
I don't know. That's a good question. I don't remember. I do remember something about it, but I couldn't tell you.
So how do you feel now about all those years you spent without dogs?
You get them when the time is right for you, I guess. The kids are like, oh, now, that we're not here. But, I don't know how it would have been different, but I think, you have to come to it in your own time, and maybe it wouldn't have been right. Maybe it would have been overwhelming to have 2 young kids and a dog, and, and my older son seemed to be allergic to everything, and I'm not sure how would that have worked out. I don't know. So I don't look back on it too much and think, oh, we could have had all these years with these other dogs. I'm happy with these guys now.
Learning from your dogs.
What's that?
Look backwards.
Yeah, right, exactly. I don't look backwards. Look forward. But anyway, thank you.
Is your book available?
Yeah, it's here. Many copies.
I'd like to get a
Sure,
copy
look.
of each for my friend who
Sure.
does rescue.
Let me turn this. That's a cool one. They're 15 each. And if you want, I actually can take a credit card if that's more convenient. I've got this, about Square. It plugs into your phone.